Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Using Elements of Evidence-Based Storytelling to Tell Your Assessment Story by Dr. Janina Baker from NILOA. We are very excited to have our speaker with us today, and all of you, thank you so much for making the time. We know you're going to find this very interesting and helpful. My name is Amber Malinowski, and I'm one of the people here at Weave. If you've been to a webinar before, you've probably heard my voice. Welcome back. If you are new to our webinars, I just wanted to quickly review the control panel for you so that you can interact with us today. If you're having any audio issues, you can switch between computer and phone audio on the far left. If you need to send us a message, you can use the chat feature, and that can be either to ask a question or, again, if you're having any kind of technical issues, and we'll get you helped out. You can also raise your hand and actually submit questions for the Q&A portion to the presenter. So you can answer questions there, and we will be sharing those with the group at the end, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A time, probably the last 5 or 10 minutes. We will be doing about 4 polls today to get to know you a little bit better as well, so we hope you'll participate in those. And if you need to leave for any reason, that's on the far right, and you're able to go ahead and exit the meeting and it'll close out. We are recording the session today, so if you need to leave early for any reason or you think someone else would enjoy watching it, then you'll be able to share that with them. At the end of the session, we will have a survey, and we really would appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to provide webinars that are really helpful to you. Thank you again for coming, and with that, I'm going to let Dr. Ray Van Dyke, our Senior Vice President here at Weave, introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Amber. And welcome, everyone. I am always excited about our webinars, but this one especially, I think, because of a number of reasons. One, the topic. As an old English teacher, I should say maybe a retired English teacher, I love the idea of thinking about assessment in terms of storytelling. And I've been thinking so much about this, and I've actually seen Janina do this presentation or some version of it a couple of times, and I can never get enough of it because I think that one of our biggest challenges as assessment practitioners on campuses is trying to make meaning of all this work that we're doing. And I think you're going to learn some fabulous ideas for how to make meaning, but then how to share that meaning for of your assessment work. And then, of course, the other reason that I'm really excited is I've met Dr. Janina Baker a while back, and she is absolutely delightful in so many ways. She's Assistant Director at National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, affectionately known by most of us on this in this webinar as NILOA. And she's just done such an amazing job there. And I think as I was reading back through her bio, I was struck by, the kinds of conversations you can have with Janina when her research interests include things like student learning outcomes assessment at minority serving institutions and community colleges, access and equity issues for underrepresented administrators and students, higher ed policy, and assessment of student learning in athletics. She could probably do another webinar just on that for us. So we are delighted to have her here, and she will begin in just a minute, but I'm going to, I think, turn it back to Amber now to do the polls.
I feel like we should let Dr. Baker at least say hello.
I'm here. Hello.
Yay! She really is here, everybody. We do have a few polls so that these are helpful so that as Dr. Baker goes through her presentation, she's able to tailor some of her examples to things that you might all be interested in. So the first one that we would like to know is, what is your role at your institution? Whether that be a university or a college, are you a student, an educator or teacher? Are you an assessment coordinator for an academic program, a program director or chair, a dean level administrator, maybe director of assessment, provost, vice provost, administrator, or other? And I'll leave this up for a little bit and give you all a chance to respond. And then I'll share those results so everybody can see. Looks like almost everyone has had a chance to participate. It sounds like someone isn't able to see the poll. Sometimes it's another window inside the Zoom webinar. So if you minimize something, it might be underneath. 5% of you are students. That's awesome. 8% are educators or professors. 10% are assessment coordinators for a program. 5% are program directors or chairs. 2% are dean level administrators. 39% are directors of assessment. We have 2% that are provost or vice provost administrators, and then 31% are other. Our next one, we would like to know what type of institution you are at. So these are taken from that Carnegie classification. Couple of different kinds here. Just tell us a little bit about the institution where you work or attend classes. Voting's going a little quicker on this one. I wonder if on the last poll, perhaps people have more than one role. So they had to pick the one that they do most of the time. Okay. Almost everyone has had a chance to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share these. 43% of you today are from a doctoral research university, 21% from a master's or college, 13% from baccalaureate, 4% from associates in baccalaureate, 10% from associates, 1% from special focus, and 7% are other. And then this is the final one that we'll do for right now. This one's really easy. Have you heard of NILOA? Okay. I'll go ahead and share this one as well. 76% of you with us today have heard of NILOA and 24% have not. So welcome. You'll be hearing a little bit more about that. Thank you for participating in those. I know a couple of you had trouble seeing, so I'll troubleshoot that behind the scenes, but I will let Dr. Baker take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly as we get started. And thank Amber Ann, who's behind the scenes, for all of your help in helping us get this going and started. And Ray, thank you so much for your very incredibly kind introduction and also invitation to present. So thank you all, and thank you for filling out the polls. It gives us some good information to think about as we go on to create resources, and hopefully as we talk today, you can hopefully hear some resources that are helpful to you, especially within your context. So to get us started, thank you for joining me this afternoon to talk stories. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to grab your lunch, sit back, and join me in a conversation on using elements of evidence-based storytelling to better tell your assessment story. I think I probably should have titled this maybe lunchtime stories. I thought about bedtime stories for a second, but didn't do it. But I think that hopefully you'll find this useful as you munch and lunch through this hour. I hope that you'll find this information useful to your work. And as Amber said, if you need to, we want to ask a question, please use the chat function, and we can work to answer those towards the end of the hour. NILOA itself, many of you have heard of us, and so I'm glad that you've been able to hopefully use our resources and that they've been working for you. But we were established in 2008 by Dr. Stan Eikenberry, who's the former president of the University of Illinois, as well as George Koo, a prominent researcher in higher ed literature. And we're co-located on the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign campus, as well as Indiana University Bloomington. We were formed actually in response to the Spellings Commission report that overly stated that not enough learning was happening on college campuses. And in anticipation of the Higher Education Act, we being reauthorized, we wanted to have evidence of authentic student learning when we were asked. So on the screen is our mission. It is to discover and disseminate effective use of assessment data to strengthen undergraduate and support undergraduate education and support institutions in their assessment efforts. And we accomplish this mission through our bulleted list. We're two-pronged in the way that we're a research and a resource institute, and like to consider ourselves to be responsive in the assessment field. We are currently led by the fabulous Dr. Natasha Jankowski, who I consider, and I think many others consider, to be a thought leader in the field and the scholarship of assessment. We recently redesigned our website to hopefully address the functionality and really put some good work up front. And so I hope that you've had a chance to see our old website and our new website. You've seen the difference in that. And we are really trying to work to make sure that this is user-friendly and that you can find the information that you need when you need it as you're working through assessment challenges on your own campus. We have over 10,000 subscribers to our monthly newsletter. So if you haven't already, just go to our site. At the top, it says join our email list. Click on that and we can add you right there. You'll be the first then to know about any new or updated content that's released on our website. And I think the best part of all this is that it's free. We're not member driven. So all of the resources that I talk about today and on our website are completely open and free for you to use and share among your campus. So let's talk a little bit about communication and stories and what you're really here for the meet, right? Some of you might be aware that we conduct national surveys that take stock of the assessment landscape about every 3 years. And in those surveys, we ask chief academic officers or whoever they designate about their institutional assessment approaches and practices. While I won't go into all of the findings, you'll have to actually go to our website and see that report. You can see the cover of that Assessment That Matters report that was released in January of 2018 to get the full version of it. But I just want to explore a few findings on communication and introduce a continuum of communication and transparency to help think this through. One implication that we found, and it's new, right? This is something that is not uncommon to many campuses, is that communicating effectively about student learning remains a challenge. Colleges and universities continue to struggle with this in trying to be more clear and more persuasive in communicating relevant, timely, and contextualized information on their impact on students as well as their value to society. When we talked to provosts and to further some of the points that we found within our data, when we asked provosts what outcomes are most important to share publicly, provosts themselves stated that the usual outcomes, right? Retention, persistence, graduation, completion rates, and then added on outcome information such as job placement rates, salary. You can see that they wanted more information on accreditation. And pushing a bit even further, what we found that was what was most important to provosts was not necessarily what to share, but how to share that information. And so we'll go through a little bit about what that looks like, right? We know that we have tons of data, but how do we actually work to share that information? In fact, as we look at institutional websites, and you might even think of your own institutional website right now, we continue to find limited available information on institutional websites. In fact, there's some work around organizational digital narratives, or looking at our collective story that's presented online across web pages, narratives, initiatives, and ask an institution, what are we about? Who are we? What do we do well? And if this message is consistent throughout the website. This work it recognizes that institutional websites are prime spaces to communicate assessment of student learning results, but are oft forgotten about spaces. I have a background in institutional research and institutional effectiveness and planning, and for some of you, this might look familiar. I know this was my office. I needed all the paper, right? And for some, the approach is still that you flood people with data, right? As we think about what we're doing, and even as you have access to data, right? How do you get it? Is it generally the reports that are presented by instruments? Often that there's little connection between those items or measures or instruments, or on your website, perhaps you post tons of reports and people are getting the reports and they're trying to work through them, make sense of it. But again, as you see, all in the name of transparency, you make all of it available with very little meaning making behind the scenes. In addition, some of our current approaches, when we do this, we in fact overwhelm them with access to data without meaning making. Perhaps we make bullet lists that we try to make it easier for people to read. However, we overload them with information and we end up guessing what people want and or need. Perhaps through that, we build an archive of reports, again, in our work in trying to be transparent, that documents our processes, but it's a history of data collection or changes made, but really nothing more in terms of meaning making. Or we just post individual student stories, again, not collecting up and seeing what we're actually doing and how, again, our context really works for these students, where perhaps the student would have been successful anyway. So why such limited information, right? It's hard to know if the general reader would actually understand assessment results and their use, or even be interested in knowing about the topic. In addition, there's a lack of consensus if information should be comparable across institutions, if it should provide program level or institution level evidence, and if and what evidence actually provides proof of learner gains, growth, or even value added by the institution. At the most recent Association of American Colleges and Universities annual meeting, Jillian Kinsey, one of our senior scholars, provided some potential explanations to further explain some of these from some of the findings from the Provost survey around communication. The first gap, one of presentation and interpretation, looks at that gap that's between audience understanding and assessment evidence. I think the quote here helps think about this in a different way. So one provost stated, "We can provide all the assessment results or data we like, but if others cannot interpret them accurately, there's no benefit to transparency or accountability." And in case you are more of a visual learner, I'll put it another way, and this cartoon is one that we use often, right? And thinking about helping us think through this gap, right? On the left-hand side, you have what you want to say, and the right-hand side, you have what they're interested in, and in the middle, you can find where that is the relevant piece. Another gap, that's one of meaning making, is that communicating outputs is not sufficient. In fact, outcome results must be made more meaningful for target audiences. To further this point, I think the quote from the provost helps really emphasize that it's not easy to share in sound bites, and communicating outputs such as employment rates and beginning salaries does not serve as a proxy for student learning quality of programs. We need to find ways to help the general public make meaning of the results. And if you need a visual to help understand where we're trying to go here, hopefully this one will help you, right? And what is that miracle? How can we, and we absolutely should be more explicit about what we're doing on our campuses for students around learning. So we talked to the provosts, we asked them, again, what help do you need? They said, a little bit about what to share, a lot about how to share, and even more so, how to communicate a nuanced, complex picture of student learning that couples evidence of learning outcomes, student success data such as persistence and graduation rates. That sounds easy, right? We can all do that, sitting in our office right now. Let's go ahead and get started there, right? In that same presentation at AAC&U, Dr. Kinsey put forward this continuum for institutions to help think about how they communicate assessment of student learning. And as you think about that nuanced, complex picture, right, I want to show this to you and invite you to think about where your own institution falls, and we can then begin thinking about strategies to help you move to the right. That first stage is very much one of compliance, where you post outcomes and select results, most likely those that are favorable to your institution. The next one is pretty much what we discussed earlier, where the institution overshares and floods their institution with data that's easy to measure, to show that they're doing something, right, to just get it out. What comes next is a much more measured or tailored approach, where institutions begin to think about their audience and purpose, and where they're communicating this information and how. Following next is where an institution begins to really take stock of what's happening on campus, where learning is taking place both in and out of the classroom, and that information is used to provide a more complete picture of student learning. And then on this continuum, what follows is pretty much as stated, a nuanced, tailored framework for communicating outcomes, improvements in a comprehensive, student-focused, culturally responsive way. It's a lot there, right? What you see overall from the left to the right is this shift of an institution that just needs something to communicate to that of an institution using frameworks to help guide its communication processes, specifically around assessment of student learning. So let's stop here and take a poll. Where do you think your institution currently is on this continuum? All those same options are listed here. Just take a minute and think about where you are and mark it down.
People are voting. They're just taking a minute to think about it.
I know. It's
a hard question.
It is a hard question. But I have my people on the phone. There's a lot of directors of assessment, so I'm be interested to see the data.
Yeah. I think we're getting close. It's slowing down. Hopefully those of you who couldn't see the polls before can now. I moved it over onto a different screen. I don't know if that'll fix it, but it's worth a try. Okay. I think everybody had a chance, so I'm going to go ahead and share these. Oh, good. That worked. The good old Microsoft reboot. I just closed it and opened it somewhere else. Good. I'm glad that other people were able to see them. And I'm going to leave them here and share them too, so hopefully you'll be able to see those. So 34% selected the first one, compliance, posting of outcomes and select favorable results. 25% for the second one, oversharing of easy to measure outcomes and results. And 21% for the third, more tailored posting of outcomes. 18% for the next one, more complete picture of all the places learning occurs. And then 1% for the last one, a nuanced, tailored framework.
I want to know who you are. You need to talk. We got to get your story out.
Thanks, everybody, for participating in that. That was a really interesting question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all. I hope that this gives you a way to think about, you know, as you're working to tell some more evidence-based stories, that this helps you on your path and thinking about what it is that you're trying to do on your campus. I think that for those of you that were more on the left, I'm sure you're thinking, you know, what are some strategies to help me move to the right? And I think if any of you have been to any types of professional development lately in conferences, annual meetings, you'll notice that there's been an emphasis in narratives and storytelling, that they're working to try to assist institutions in actually communicating what's happening around student learning. And so backing up the data and findings, right, I want to talk a little bit about why stories can help assist with this. Dr. Jankowski, our director, often speaks of a few of these scholars in this space, and thinking about why stories matter, why storytelling matters, and specifically why evidence-based storytelling is particularly important in the work that we're doing. I think if we just take a step back and think about just stories in itself, Linda Shediaw talks a bit about the stories that we share, tell others a bit about our assumptions about the roles of students, of faculty, and of content, and they help inform, perhaps even alter the thinking of others. And through stories, we seek to actually make believers out of our readers. And if we do it right, as Brookfield writes, stories allow us to go assumption hunting. Building on the use of stories, I'll say that Dr. Jankowski is actually, she's worked to develop and explain this concept of evidence-based storytelling, and there'll be a paper out hopefully by the end of this month to go along with this to help pull out and tease out some of these parts particularly, but I want to go broadly and talk about what it is that we've been working on thus far. So using some information that we collected from case studies around data use, as well as being informed by the NILOA transparency framework, I'll show you that in a few slides. Dr. Jankowski developed this definition that we use to explain evidence-based storytelling. And that is, it's evidence of student learning that is used in support of claims or arguments about improvement and accountability told through stories to persuade a specific audience, right? Those bolded pieces are specifically important to this definition. It's almost the whole definition in itself, right? But those bolded pieces really pull out those pieces as we're thinking about when we're trying to tell an evidence-based storytelling, what are those that we need to make sure that we're including in our story, that way our audiences know what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and what we're using, the mediums that we're using it through, right? Because we need to tell our story and help students tell theirs. In this first point, when you saw in that evidence-based storytelling definition around supportive claims or arguments, evidence-based storytelling uses Toolman's argumentation model to assist in thinking about warrants or arguments, however you want to frame that. So really, truly, what we're doing is selecting a variety of evidence, student learning, right, which may change depending on the audience, and providing that in relation to a claim that's made about the improvement of student learning. The warrant in itself outlines and justifies why we think this change for these students at this institution at this time will lead to improvement that we want to see in student learning, or at least why we think it will. If you are interested in more about this argumentation model, of course, you can do some more research yourself. But in that paper that I described that Natasha is working on evidence-based storytelling, there will be much more detail regarding the argumentation model itself. So make sure you do join our email list so you can have access to the paper when it is available. So again, if we're thinking about that last question, why do we think that what we are doing for these students would lead to enhanced learning at this time, right? What argument do you want to make about your students' learning, and what type of evidence would actually be necessary to help make that argument? What do we want to know about our students? To further this, and thinking about stories and storytelling, and thinking about the evidence that we need, right? Let's look at a quote from Ms. Levy in Wisconsin. Hope I did justice to your name. Educational assessment is at heart an exercise in evidentiary reasoning. From a handful of things that students say, do, or make, we want to draw inferences about what they know, can do, or have accomplished more broadly. Or even this one from Mackle and Rooney. When we're trying to tell this story, that assessment is essentially a process of telling a story about our people, programs, services that are told to many different people in many different ways with many different foci. They argue that the storyline surrounding an assessment ultimately aims to include enough evidence to make well-reasoned assertions, right? So we have the framing of why stories, more specifically evidence-based stories that are needed, but how do we do this? Well, I have good news for you, in case you didn't know. While the occasional paper is still in the works, we have worked to develop an evidence-based storytelling toolkit. Again, it's available for free and downloadable on our website. The link is actually included on your screen. And this particular toolkit is designed to help you think through various elements in the creation of a compelling evidence-based story. It was developed through document and narrative analysis review of accreditation reports, program reviews, and annual assessment reports. In addition to individual questions to consider when crafting such a narrative, the toolkit includes resources for undertaking a group activity, to peer review reports, documents, or data visualizations. We've actually used this peer review process a few times. It's been field tested over the past few years and refined with different groups, including assessment professionals, faculty, institutional research staff, and we're continuing to gather examples. And so if you even have an example of something that's being used on your campus, some type of evidence-based story, we welcome those examples. We'd love to showcase it on our website. So I hope you'll take a chance to look at that section of our website, because it does provide you with tools such as this. This is in the next two slides, this slide and the next slide actually goes through some of those elements of when we talk about an evidence-based story, what is it that we're looking for? What is it that we're hoping that you can help think through and answer, and then, of course, write or tell your story in the way that makes most sense to your institution or context. So to briefly go through some of these, right? The first one is just audience, right? Who for whom is this narrative written? What counts as evidence for the different audiences of the report? So really starting to think through audience and purpose. Those are two big pieces of thinking about evidence-based storytelling stories and thinking about what the needs are. So audience and purpose is definitely where we start. And then we move into what kind of story are you trying to tell? Is it one of compliance or improvement? Is it loss or struggle? My favorite, I think, is tragedy, right? And thinking about what kinds of stories are out there. But what kind of story are you trying to tell? And what context is needed for readers to actually understand your story? And of course, who are the characters? What are their motivations? Is there someone with whom your audience is likely to identify, right? Who is that person that's driving the action? Maybe one, maybe two, maybe three characters in it, but the story part of this work is very much central to just the stories that you read daily, right? Audience, what kind of story, what characters are central to both ideas, right? And then going a bit further, what's the plot? What is that causal sequence of events that includes your setting and your conflict? What evidence do you have to assert your claims? And something that as we refine this process, we've thought even further about visuals and mediums, right? So questions 6 and 7 talk about what's the best medium through which to share based on the story you've crafted. Does a video make sense? Does it make sense to write it? Is there some place that you could, is there a way to combine those different ideas to a space to really share what you're trying to say? And then if you're using visuals in your narrative, are they appropriate? Do they help support your story, or do they actually detract from what you're trying to share? So thinking about how you're including images into the work itself. And then as we continue to talk about communication, how will you make your target audience aware of the story, right? So if you look back again, audience, what kind of story are you telling? What are the characters? What's the plot? What evidence do you have? How are you going to share it? If you're using visuals, are they appropriate? And how will you make your target audience aware? Those elements make up really what we're talking about when we say evidence-based stories. These are the kinds of pieces of information that we want to know. Now, looking at visualizations and thinking about those, one thing that I want to just quickly at least address is that we do need to explore intersections between data visualization and narratives and understand which mediums work best for which narratives. Some visualizations are very cool to look at, but oftentimes are confusing and can easily be misinterpreted by viewers. So it's difficult to do, but when it's done well, you can find a really good match between visuals, narrative, and audience, and it makes and tells the story in itself. For instance, this is one where students are able to think about their journey through the system in terms of needed and required steps, right? The visualization doesn't take away, it actually adds to the story. And students can use this as they are going through Capilano Community College. So thinking just a little bit about data visualizations and how they can detract or add and or help you tell your story. So as I promised, right, and thinking about evidence-based stories and the work that we're doing here at NILOA, a lot of the work was informed by the NILOA Transparency Framework. And so I want to share just pieces of that because parts of these elements of evidence-based storytelling and telling your story will require you to think about pieces of this transparency framework in telling it. So the transparency framework was designed to support institutions in sharing evidence of student learning on and off campus. It was based on a review of institutional websites and identified 6 key components of student learning assessment that hopefully institutions will use to examine their institutional websites to gauge the extent to which evidence of student accomplishment is readily accessible, potentially useful, and meaningful to the intended audience. Each section, which I'll go through briefly next, of the framework suggests a component of student learning assessment that may be of interest to specific audiences and outlines opportunities to advance public understanding. So those 6 components are here. Assessment resources, that first one, It encompasses information or training that's provided to faculty and staff to help them understand, develop, implement, communicate, use evidence of student learning. That next to the right of that is the use of student learning evidence, where we identify areas where changes in policies and practices might lead to improvement, inform institutional decision-making, problem identification, planning, goal setting, faculty development, course revision, program review, and accountability or accreditation self-study. Right below that are current assessment activities, that third component, which includes information on a full range of projects and activities that were perhaps recently completed or are currently underway to gauge student learning, make improvements, or respond to accountability interests. Institutional assessment plans, right, that can include institution-wide or program-specific approaches that convey how student learning will be assessed, data collection and tools and approaches that will be used, as well as a timeline for implementation. And then those last two, evidence of student learning, includes results of assessment activities and may include evidence of indirect, such as surveys, or direct, such as portfolios around student learning, as well as institutional performance indicators, such as licensure pass rates. And then most importantly, not last, most importantly, our student learning outcome statements that clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and habits of mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution of higher education. So those are the 6 components that make up the transparency framework. We have a whole section on our website dedicated to transparency, and I invite you to look up this information if you're much more interested and want some more examples of what's happening in the field around this work. Pretty much anything that the evidence-based storytelling work, the excellence in assessment work that I'll go through here in a second, as well as the transparency framework, are all found in the transparency section of our website. So definitely helps you think through how you might communicate internally and externally to different audiences. So why even bring up the transparency framework and thinking about evidence-based storytelling? Because we have some examples of good work around institutions who have really been thinking through this. In partnership with the Voluntary System of Accountability, the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities, and the Association of American Colleges and Universities, we're working with institutions to help them better tell their stories, right? Using evidence. The Excellence in Assessment designation was started in 2016. And through this process, we use a rubric that was developed and informed, again, by the NILOA Transparency Framework, with an intentional focus on communication of assessment processes and results to assist institutions in telling their assessment story. We found that even those institutions that are engaged in intentionally aligned assessment of student learning still struggle to tell their stories to the variety of stakeholders they are accountable to. While most institutions now make a practice of publicly stating what their learning outcomes are, they generally share assessment findings internally and frequently only to faculty or even assessment committees. Rarely are assessment plans or rationales shared even with students, alums, much less with external stakeholders such as employers or institutions who accept students for continued study, state legislators, or even the public. Put another way, campuses talk about assessment to themselves when they talk about it at all. So we see a little bit about why we created the designation, right? All of those stakeholders are extremely important in telling their story. Not only are they, do they inform the story, but they're also a group to communicate it to. And despite the challenges that I just discussed, many institutions are successfully designing and implementing institution-wide assessment systems that provide evidence of the learning of all students and able to effectively tell the stories. And we want to celebrate such successes. If you're interested, again, there's more information on our website, but briefly, these are the application components. Just first is a letter from senior campus leadership, whether it's president, chancellor, provost, a completed campus contacts form, an annotated list of individuals that actually assist with or are engaged in assessment activities across the campus. And probably the most important is your application narrative. And you can see some pieces on there of between 2,000 and no more than 3,000 words. Tables and figures actually count towards that. And here is where the meat of it is, right? In telling your story. You have to talk about each of those transparency framework components in under 3,000 words in a story that's evaluated by national assessment experts to really say, do they know what's happening on their campus, especially institutionally around assessment? Do they have enough evidence to provide support for that? We are really starting to get some really good stories. You can see that we've had several classes come out from the designation itself. And this is the most recent class announced. And information on all the institutions can be found in our site. But you can see there's a variety of institutional types that are addressed, and each of them do a really good job talking about their context, talking about what makes them unique. So what do we know about good stories? We've had a lot of data to collect and to think about, right? And from that, we know that a good story is easy to read. It introduces a problem, shares how the problem is solved, highlights the role of the institution of addressing the problem, but we don't put up evidence without context or data as a standalone. In fact, we need context and a story because evidence gives stories substance, but stories give evidence meaning. Our stories can be our context, our histories, our missions, or as Burton Clark says, our organizational saga. It is how we see the world and why we do what we do. An evidence-based story pushes back on assumptions, creates narratives that will resonate with internal and external stakeholders such as students, faculty, and employers. Most of all, tells an improvement story. In fact, an evidence-based story is a way to bring together improvement and accountability in a meaningful mechanism. I think this point is reinforced by a piece from Lee Schulman in Change Magazine back in 2007, which argues about accounting is about giving an account or telling a story. We have a challenge. We rarely provide the information needed to make a compelling narrative to specific audiences because we don't make arguments. So as you take all of that information, right, put it together, and as you think about how to share this information, right, I invite you to apply for the Excellence in Assessment designation, get some feedback from those national assessment experts, right, and thinking about how you might tell your institutional assessment story. But in that process of trying to tell that story, here's some additional thoughts, right? Provide reports that begin the meaning-making process for readers. We have to synthesize information and present findings. We need to connect the reader to the data, make it lived, tie it tied to a story, a persona, just make it real to enhance use, connect with it. People are more likely to do something to use that data to inform practice when that's done. And while questions might be in a particular order in a survey, we don't have to stick to that for findings. We can group things together around share points that make sense for the reader and enhance the argument. Think of something like a crossword puzzle, right? And thinking about bullets, as I mentioned earlier, right? Instead of just throwing a bunch of scattershot bullets up there, they're not narratives, right? And if everything is a bullet, there's no point to it. It takes up space that you could use for other things. So if it's not, there's no point to have them. Some additional considerations. Remember to answer the so what question. Again, why are we doing this for these students at this time? Why, right? Really, again, going back to the argument piece of this. As we discussed earlier, in thinking about flooding people with data, we tend to, again, to report by instrument, not topic, and we miss those opportunities to pull data together across various sources. In that same space, being mindful of direct and indirect measures of assessment and how they can provide strong evidence when used together to help with that is also a consideration as you're trying to draft this narrative, right? Targeting the report to institutional priorities. I used to work in institutional effectiveness and planning. That was a primary goal of mine. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to address? Is it the mission? Is it the strategic plan? Is it an initiative that the institution or state mandate that the state is requiring of us? How can we target this back to one of our institutional priorities? Something that's just a common thing that we see, just adding contact information for any follow-up questions whenever you're writing this narrative, this report. Who can I reach out to? And something that's just thinking about the report itself, right? Using bold, color, images to draw attention, give readers a path through the report. Again, not detracting from the message that you're trying to send, right? Adding visuals that only add to that narrative, and thinking again about the best medium to use that through. And just a few final points. Before you include some information, right? Really start to think about and move beyond summary or the description to analysis and synthesis. Is this contextual information that needs to be included? Can we impact this number? Is this something you can do about it? Presenting less and more findings together, not jumping back between the two. To a reader, it's like changing the range, right? From 1 to 5, with 5 being strongly agreed to where 1 is being strongly agreed. It's confusing for many of them. And so then again, it's harder for them to follow through your narrative and your argument. And then lastly, I think probably one of the most important points that we stress is that it's not really about the methodology, but more about the argument that's being presented. You need enough information to trust the data that's used in the argument for it to be compelling. And if people attack the methods, it's because they don't want to believe the data. So as you're out there working on your narratives, hopefully, or inspiring others, encouraging others to help with that, I hope that these are some points that stick out or come to mind through this work. And I'll leave you with a quote from George Koo, who wrote back in 2007, Change Magazine. And I left the picture. It's progress, not perfection, right? He says, but with practice and patience, we will all get better at deciding what to measure, how to measure it, and using what we learn to improve the quality. This is all work that we're trying to do. We're trying to get better at. I can't say that there's any one right way to do this work, but context matters. How this work plays out in your institution it looks quite different from others, but explaining why you're doing, who you're doing it for is extremely important, again, in making those warrants and arguments and what we're calling evidence-based storytelling. And with that, I will leave some time for some questions. There's my contact information as well as our website. I hope that you will go and peruse it a bit. You might get lost a little bit in there because there's so much good stuff, but I hope that you'll find it useful and provide us with feedback and let us know how we can assist you in your work. So with that, Amber, are there any questions?
There are a couple on, this is a great time to ask questions if you have them. The ones that I've gotten, I've pasted into a slide here, so we can do those in just a moment, but this is such an informative slide that's up right now. I don't want you to take it down just yet in case people are trying to.
Nope, I'll leave it up.
Okay, awesome. So I'll just read these ones out loud for now, and then if we get more, I'll go ahead and throw up my screen. But
Okay.
And Ray, feel free to jump in here if there was anything you wanted to say. I apologize. I don't want to talk over you either.
I will do that.
So the first question, we're a Canadian institution that is leading the way in the direct assessment for theological schools in competency-based education. Does the excellence in assessment designation embrace the international schools, or is it only recognizing American institutions?
It's a great question. We continue to wrestle with that one. At the time, we accept applications from all degree granting regionally accredited institutions. So if you fall under that, we absolutely will accept the application. That said, we have had other institutional types submit an application, and at the very least, you do receive the feedback. And so we still invite you to apply, regardless of the status, because I think that feedback is invaluable as you go along your assessment journey. So yes, if you have further questions, please email me out. I'd be happy to talk to you further about that.
Great, thank you. And the second one that we have, could you talk more about trusting the data without sound methodology?
Yes, that last slide. Well, I think sound is probably the key word in that. And I don't think that we said that you don't need sound methodology. You definitely have to have reasons to why you're using the methods that you use. And I think that's more of the conversation that we want to have. You know, why are you using that in particular? That helps to address hopefully we'll address some of the critics in the audience, but again, what is the argument that you're trying to make? If you're trying to use, I don't know, some data that just doesn't go along with the story that you're trying to tell, easily will be dismissed. And so I think it almost goes along with the conversation that's happening around programs that are happening, right? If they're not well implemented, then they're probably not going to have the same effect, right? So thinking again about context and those other pieces, explaining why you're doing what you're doing and the methods that you're using are all key pieces of that. But again, it comes back to the argument that you're trying to make and what that is. So yes, I hope everyone is using sound methods and appropriate again to your context. And obviously you can interpret that in different ways, but not saying that you shouldn't do that.
Got a couple more. I'm going to go ahead and present my screen.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm a visual learner, so I like to be able to see the question.
Yeah.
So this way you can see it, Dr. Baker, and so can everybody else, and you won't be as tormented by my reading aloud. Can narratives be used not only to tell the story, but to gather evidence in place of quantitative data? For example, humanities faculty want to tell a story about what students learn throughout their courses, and the program chair wants to aggregate those narratives into one overall story of learning achievement and how to improve. Is this too thin in the absence of quantitative data measurements or targets?
I think that's a really good question.
It is.
It's a really good question, one that we get constantly and that I'm sure is happening on campuses across the nation. As something that we talk about within the Excellence in Assessment designation is that we're looking for institutional assessment approaches and practices. But we're also hoping that through that, it's informed by what's happening in the program and in the courses. So it's not to say that those individual narratives is thin, right? If you can aggregate that up to really tell a story about what students learned, that is in essence what we're shooting for. I think going through that particular process helps to understand this piece, right? We're hoping that, I mean, you might have a lot of assessment activity happening at the course level, but less so at the program and less even at the institutional level, right? Because you're using that information to inform what's happening. And so in that space, I think that the faculty itself, both are actually right, but I want to see what that story looks like. And then as you develop that, let's see then what pieces are missing. It's hard to say without seeing that story, but that's exactly what we're hoping gets done, because I think then you're able to see, and hopefully you're including students maybe in this conversation and thinking and looking at the story, right, of what's missing, if anything, and really be able to provide that more complete picture of what's happening in that particular program. It's a great question.
I've had several people ask if you will be sharing your slides.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. And we are recording this. I had someone asked about that as well. And our next question, if good stories are tailored to specific audiences, how do you write an effective story when you have no idea who might be looking at it? For example, on your website.
I think it's a great question. I think often people struggle with that. I look at so many websites themselves and I'm like, who is this even geared for? I don't know that it tells me the story. It doesn't provide me with additional information about who you as an institution are and what you're trying to do with your students. So in some ways, you have to tell your story and be ready to defend why you're saying it in that way, right? Not even knowing who potentially is looking at it. On the flip side of that, your marketing, your IR department, someone should have some idea of who's looking at what, and you can get some more information there. and then use that information as you're working to write an effective story. But someone has some idea on your campus. Start with your IR.
This next question kind of relates to some of your comments on the first one, but if someone does submit, is there a cost for the feedback that they would receive?
There is not. Yay! I know.
Yay! That's awesome.
No, it's not. We have been at this for what, 4 years now, and our 5th year of the designation is approaching us. The application should be out in December of this year. Again, if you join the email list, you'll be alerted to when that's actually out, and applications are due, I believe, May 1st of next year. So you can start to work on that. You can see the rubric that we use in the application packet from last year to help get you started. It won't vary too much of what we had this past year, but that process kicks off in December, and the timeline is actually up on the website itself. And then you'll get feedback around July. Institutions will also be notified if they've received the designation or not around July, and then we publicly announce in August of each year. So no cost. Really good feedback.
And we must have one of those wonderful people on the call that you mentioned a minute ago for the previous question, somebody who does marketing or that kind of work. And their suggestion was to use Google Analytics to figure out who is on your website. And then your story can have some elements that will appeal to all stakeholders. But if you can learn a bit more about who visits your website, you can tailor those stories a little bit more. So thank you for that comment.
I love when others help others. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. The next question, what if something doesn't yield statistical significance, but it's practical? How would you recommend conveying that to, say, a dean or a provost?
Well, that is a topic for another day.
A whole nother webinar.
It is. Oh gosh, we've embarked on some work. Natasha Jankowski again has led us in thinking about mental models around assessment, right? And so there's different spaces with different perspectives that people come from. Some might be more measurement, right? That says, you know, your N size is too small, or, you know, you don't have an appropriate effect size, right? And it's not that their perspective is wrong. They're just coming at it from a different space. And so as you're thinking about your argument, right, and working to talk to them about assessment, you really have to start thinking about that lens that they have and how you can shift your argument to that, right? There's other things other models that we're thinking about around compliance, around teaching and learning. There's we're working on that a little bit more. There's a little bit out that's right now. If you look at, I'll have to put the reference in to the slides, but there's an assessment update issue where Natasha talks a little bit about these models, and as we are continue this work, we're trying to find out if there's more. And so definitely, I think understanding again who your audience is and the perspective is extremely important as you work to craft that argument. But it can be done. It can be.
And I think this is our final question, at least for right now. Could the story you tell be utilized as you're closing the loop discussion at the academic year's end?
Ooh, why not? Why, and why couldn't you have, even then, well, you said it in your question, discussion, right? So allowing other perspectives in as they read the story, as they think through the story, right? Yeah, I love that idea. Could definitely be a part of even kicking off the next year's work, right? Because we know with an assessment, it's never done. You're always supposed to be improving, right? Progress, not perfection. So thinking about how this could use to even jumpstart some activity on your campus might be a good way as well. But showing that you're using the information to tell a story, even in particular, an evidence-based story could be very powerful for your campus, especially if you've been mired in just tons of data that hasn't been synthesized, or there's been little meaning making. But yeah, I love that idea. And let us know if you do it, how it goes.
Yes.
I love that. I love that idea also. And I think it's, you know, it as you were saying, it could be, you know, not only this year's, kind of closing the loop for this year, but looking ahead to next year for like chapter 2 of your story, or chapter 3 or chapter 4 or whatever it might be, and continuing the story then over the years rather than just kind of focusing on the current year. Janina, thank you so very much. Amber's going to talk a bit more in a minute, but I wanted to just say this while I was unmuted. This has been wonderful, so very helpful, and thank you for everything that you've shared. It's terrific, and we really appreciate all the work, the great work that NILOA is doing. We've got in our Knowledge Center also a lot of resources for folks. So there are a lot of resources out there to help with this work if we continue to let people know about them. So I'll stop now and let Amber go, but thanks, Janina.
Very welcome. Thank you again for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really informative and helpful and interesting, and we had a lot of great questions as well. Thank you all for coming as well. And there was one other person from the Weave team on the call today that I did not get to thank, and Janina did it kind of in the beginning, but Brianna is on our team, and she takes care of how you register and all of that good stuff. So I really appreciate all that kind of invisible work that she does behind the scenes. So thank you very much to Brianna as well. If you wouldn't mind taking the survey, it will pop up when you leave the window. It will probably open in another browser. It's just a Survey Monkey, nothing more mysterious than that, but it really helps us keep good information on what we're doing and get more ideas from you about things that you're interested in. So if you wouldn't mind taking that, we'd really appreciate it. Our next webinar is next Wednesday on the 6th, and it is about data visualization, which I can never say. But that's going to be a really good session as well, and relates to this in some ways, I think, also. And the link for that registration will be in the Knowledge Center. So if you just want to go to our website, it's weaveeducation.com, go to Knowledge Center, and we have upcoming webinars there, and we also have all of our past webinars. We've had a couple of presenters that have been involved with NILOA, actually, and the recording for this one will live there as well, along with the slides. So please feel free to check that out and look at old webinars or register for the next one. We love to meet people in person. We don't get to do it very often. So if anyone who came today is going to be at the Virginia Assessment Group or the SACS or Middle States annual meetings, Ray and I will be at several of those, and we would love to meet you in person.
Amber, someone just asked the question real quickly about the time of the webinar. It's 3 p.m. Eastern time. The next one.
Thank you for catching that. I didn't see that pop up. I appreciate it. So it's going to be at 3 Eastern. We do record them all and post them as well. So if you can't make it at that time, go ahead and register, and we'll send you the link afterwards. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much for presenting, Dr. Baker. That was wonderful. Again, we invite you to visit our website and poke around in the Knowledge Center. If you have any questions, we would love to help you, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Everybody, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.